The first explosion of fire shattered the night. Flames ripped through the wooden beams of the house, roaring like a beast unleashed, while screams tore the air wide open. Glass windows burst, sending shards raining onto the lawn, and smoke rose in a black, choking cloud that turned the stars to ash. Inside, chaos reigned, a child's desperate cry echoing above the crackle of collapsing timber, a mother's voice breaking as she begged for mercy no one would give. The protagonist stood just yards away, frozen in horror, watching everything they had built burn to the ground. Heat seared their face, the fire so close it singed their skin, yet they could not move. Every memory, family dinners, laughter on the porch, their child's first steps across that living room was now reduced to smoke and cinders. Neighbors gathered in the distance, their silhouettes illuminated by the firelight, but none stepped forward to help. Their silence was as violent as the flames themselves. And then, the sound that would never leave their mind, the high-pitched scream of a child trapped upstairs, cut off by the splintering collapse of the roof. The world went silent except for the roar of fire, a silence louder than any scream, a silence that carved grief deep into the bone. This was no accident. The fire was not just meant to destroy a home, it was meant to erase a family, to remind them of their place in a town that had never welcomed them. But what the arsonists never imagined was that this night, drenched in smoke and blood-red light, would not end in silence. It would ignite something even more dangerous than fire vengeance. But before the fire, before the night when everything was reduced to smoke and ash, there had been life, ordinary, fragile, and full of small joys. On summer mornings, sunlight would pour through the kitchen windows, catching on the edges of old lace curtains that the mother had stitched by hand. The smell of butter sizzling in a cast-iron pan mixed with the laughter of children arguing over who would get the last pancake. The father would sit at the table in his work clothes, coffee steaming in his chipped mug, smiling quietly as he watched the family's chaos unfold. It was in these unremarkable rituals that their world felt steady, Safavan in a town that had never fully welcomed them. In the evenings, the porch became their sanctuary. The children would chase one another barefoot across the grass, their squeals carrying into the twilight, while the parents rocked gently in weather-worn chairs. They spoke in hushed voices about the future, saving enough to expand the house, maybe even starting a small business in town. They dreamed, even when the odds pressed heavily against them. For them, hope was not a luxury, it was survival. Sundays brought church, where faith held them together as much as hymns did. They dressed neatly, the children in pressed shirts and bright ribbons, and walked into a sanctuary where every head turned. The stairs were sharp, cold reminders that their presence unsettled the town's order, yet they sang louder, prayed harder, because their faith was both shield and defiance. Still, the hostility lurked at the edges of their lives. A broken window here, slurs whispered by passing cars, the long, watchful silence of neighbors who never waved back. It wasn't constant violence, it was the quiet weight of being unwelcome, the reminder that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how kind they were still outsiders in a place that had drawn its lines in skin color long before they arrived. The father bore it silently. He labored in the fields from dawn to dusk, sweat pouring down his back, his hands rough from tools and soil. Every dollar he brought home felt like a shield against poverty, proof that dignity could not be stolen by hatred. The mother, with endless patience, stitched clothing late into the night, humming softly as her children slept. Their values were stitched into every action. Work hard, love fiercely, hold fast to faith. To the children, the world still felt bright. They played marbles in the dirt, shared secrets under the oak tree, and believed that tomorrow always held more joy. They did not yet understand the weight pressing on their parents' shoulders, the fear carried in every glance exchanged at the town's grocery store, the calculation of which roads to avoid at night. For them, home was safety, laughter, and warmth. And in many ways it was. Within the four walls of their modest house, they built something stronger than bricks: trust, love, unity. Around the dinner table, conversations stretched long after the plates were cleared. The father told stories of his childhood, painting a world where resilience was born from hardship. The mother reminded them to treat people with kindness, even those who showed none in return. Their lives were not perfect, but they were full, and they clung to that fullness with pride. Yet beneath the laughter, beneath the nightly prayers and hopeful plans, there was an unspoken tension. Every smile carried a shadow. Every dream felt fragile, as though it rested on ground that could be pulled out at any moment. They knew they were building a future in a place that wished to see it collapse. And so, each day became both a triumph and a gamble. Each moment of peace was savored because deep down, they all understood, though none would speak it aloud, that peace could be stolen in an instant. What they did not know was how soon that instant would come. They did not know was how soon that instant would come. The first signs were small, so small they might have been dismissed as paranoia, except that in this town, nothing was ever small. One morning the father stepped out to find the word leave painted across their fence in dripping red letters. The paint was fresh, still sticky, the letters jagged like a wound carved into wood. He scraped it off before the children could see, his jaw clenched, his hands raw from scrubbing. But the mark lingered in his mind. That night, he told his wife quietly as they sat on the porch. She bit her lip, eyes darting to the children playing tag under the stars. "Maybe it's just kids," she whispered. But they both knew better. The following week, whispers followed them in town. At the grocery store, two women paused in the produce aisle, their voices low but their eyes sharp. At church, an old man muttered loud enough to be heard, "Don't belong here." And in the schoolyard, their youngest son came home with bruises, refusing to say who had pushed him. Then came the meeting. The family had gone to the town hall, eager to propose a small business venture, an idea the father had nurtured for months. He wanted to open a repair shop, a place that could serve everyone, black or white. But as he stood before the crowd, presenting his plan, the air grew heavy with disdain. The mayor's polite smile was tight, his eyes cold. A man in the back muttered, "Not in this town." Laughter followed. The father's hands trembled as he folded his papers. He had walked into that room with hope. He walked out with the bitter taste of rejection. Still, they clung to the rhythm of their days. They kept cooking meals, telling stories, going to church. They held on because what else could they do? To give in to fear was to hand over their dignity. But fear had already crept in. One night, a rock shattered their living room window. Glass sprayed across the floor, and the children screamed. When the father rushed outside, heart pounding, all he saw were taillights disappearing down the road. The sheriff came the next day, leaned against his car, and shrugged. "Probably kids," he said. His eyes gave away nothing. His silence spoke everything, that the family prayed harder. They drew closer together, yet each day felt heavier than the last. The mother began checking the locks 3 times before bed. The father started keeping a hammer by the door. The children, once carefree, now whispered questions they should never have had to ask. Why don't they like us? Did we do something wrong? And then the night arrived. It was late, the town quiet under a blanket of stars, when the father woke to the smell of smoke. At first he thought it was a dream, until he heard the crackling, the groaning of wood under pressure. He bolted upright. Flames danced outside the window, orange tongues licking higher, growing stronger with each breath of wind. He shouted, grabbed his children, tried to herd them down the stairs. The air was thick, choking, every breath burning his lungs. The mother clutched their youngest, coughing, her eyes wide with terror. Together they pushed through the smoke, stumbling toward the door. But the fire was faster. It swallowed the porch, raced along the roof, collapsed beams around them. Sparks rained from above, searing hot, as though the night itself had turned against them. And over it all, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Neighbors stood in the shadows, watching. No one moved. No one called for help. The father's heart broke, not just from the flames, but from the betrayal written in that silence. This was not random. This was not the cruelty of fate. This was deliberate, planned, sanctioned by every quiet mouth and every turned back in that town. In the chaos, a scream split, the night a child trapped upstairs. The father lunged forward, but a wall of fire held him back. He roared, fought against it, but the flames were merciless. The sound cut off as the roof groaned and gave way. In that moment, something inside him collapsed. By dawn, the house was nothing but blackened skeletons of wood and piles of ash. Smoke still curled into the sky like a funeral hymn. The family stood barefoot on the dirt, clothes singed, faces streaked with soot and tears. Their home was gone. Their safety was gone. A life they had built, one quiet day at a time, was now rubble beneath their feet. And the town remained silent. No apologies, no arrests. Only the empty stares of neighbors who turned away as if nothing had happened. That it was then, staring into the ruins, that the father understood the truth in its full, brutal weight. This wasn't just hatred, it was a message. They weren't wanted, not here, not ever. The fire was not meant to scare, it was meant to erase. And in that revelation, grief gave way to something else. Something sharper, colder, something that burnt hotter than the flames ever had. Vengeance. Vengeance. The word seared itself into his mind that morning as he stood in front of the ashes. But vengeance was not strength, it was a hollow echo rattling inside a broken man. The father's hands trembled as he sifted through the ruins. The ash clung to his skin, black dust under his nails, the smell of smoke etched into his very breath. Here had been the dining room where laughter once rose. Here had been the children's bedroom where toys now lay melted into shapeless lumps. And there, beneath a collapsed beam, he found what was left of his daughter's favorite doll, its fabric scorched and unrecognizable. He held it to his chest, but there was no warmth left in it. Grief became a weight he could not put down. It pressed against his ribs, making each breath shallow. At night he lay awake staring at the ceiling of a borrowed room, hearing phantom cries in the smoke-stained dark. He replayed the fire in his mind endlessly, the scream, the roof's collapse, the stillness afterward. His daughter's absence was not just silence, it was a wound that would never close. He began to wither under the loss. His body weakened, appetite gone. His once steady hands shook as he tried to work. His voice, once deep with certainty, cracked when he spoke. The children watched him with wide, frightened eyes, seeing a father who no longer looked invincible. The mother tried to hold the family together, cooking meager meals, folding donated clothes, whispering prayers. But even she could not hide the shadows in her eyes. The town gave nothing back. The sheriff's report read, accidental fire. Neighbors avoided their gaze. Church pews that once held hymns now held only silence when the family entered. Their tragedy was not acknowledged. It was erased by indifference. And that erasure was its own kind of violence. Desperation grew. The father began pacing at night, unable to sleep. He wandered to the edge of the burned lot, staring at the skeletal remains of his house. The blackened beams rose like gravestones, accusing him silently. You failed. The guilt gnawed at him, sharper than hunger. He should have heard them sooner. He should have broken through the fire. He should have protected them. These thoughts devoured him, and each time he reached the same conclusion, he had been powerless. The question became unbearable. Flee or fight back. Friends from out of town urged him to leave. Take your family somewhere safe, they said. Start over. This place will never change, and a part of him wanted to. He imagined packing what little they had left, driving away until the horizon swallowed the memory of smoke. But when he looked at his children, broken but still breathing, he knew running would mean teaching them that fear was stronger than dignity. He could not live with that lesson, yet the alternative was worse. To stay meant fighting forces far larger than him, the sheriff's badge that shielded corruption, the mayor's polite cruelty, the neighbors whose silence was complicity. How could one man stand against a town built on hate? The weight of it made his bones feel brittle, days blurred. He stopped eating, he stopped speaking, save for muttered prayers. The mother found him one morning sitting in the dirt by the ruins, his hands blackened, digging barehanded through the ash as though searching for something he had lost. When she tried to pull him away, he looked at her with eyes hollowed out, a man half buried in grief. At his lowest, he questioned his own sanity. He began hearing the fire in his dreams, waking, drenched in sweat. The child's scream haunted him, not fading with time but growing louder, sharper, accusing. Some nights he thought he saw her shadow at the edge of the room, reaching for him. Was it grief, madness, or her spirit refusing to let him rest? He could not tell. Fear consumed him too, not just fear of the town, but fear of himself. Fear that his sorrow was curdling into something darker. Fear that if he chose to fight, he would lose what little humanity he had left. Fear that vengeance, once pursued, could not be undone. The mother tried to pull him back. You're all we have, she whispered. Don't let them take more from us. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. She knew that grief was stealing her husband, piece by piece. Still, he drifted further. He started carrying the hammer with him even when he left the borrowed house. He walked the streets of the town with eyes sharp, studying faces, memorizing voices. He listened for whispers, for slips, for names. The townspeople noticed the change's silence, no longer meek but heavy, dangerous. He frightened them now, though they would never admit it aloud. Everywhere he turned he saw reminders of his helplessness. The burned lot, untouched, became a symbol of the town's cruelty. Children laughed as they passed it, pointing at the charred remains as if it were a joke. And when he confronted the sheriff again, demanding answers, the man's smirk was enough to confirm the truth. This was never an accident. The guilt hardened into something else. Not hope, not peace, but a resolve sharpened by despair. He could not bring his daughter back. He could not erase the screams, but he could make sure the silence that had suffocated them would no longer go unanswered. Still, he hesitated. Each night he sat at the edge of his bed, torn between fleeing with his family and standing his ground. He weighed his children's safety against his hunger for justice. He asked himself if vengeance would protect them or destroy what was left of him. And yet, when he closed his eyes, all he saw was fire. All he heard was laughter in the distance. All he felt was guilt clawing at his chest. That guilt became the seed of his decision. It would not be long before desperation gave way to action. It would not be long before desperation gave way to action. But before action could be taken, the face of the enemy had to be understood. And in this town, the enemy was not one man, it was a structure, a body with many heads, each one feeding off silence, fear, and power. The first head was the sheriff, a man with a thick jaw, a gut that showed years of easy living, and eyes that could freeze anyone into silence. He had worn the badge for 2 decades, not because he was just, but because no one else dared to challenge him. To him, the family's burned home was just another problem to file away, another inconvenience to dismiss. He leaned on the word accident like it was truth carved in stone, smirking as though he knew no one would dare to press further. Yet behind that smirk was calculation. He believed he was protecting his town, preserving its order. In his mind, outsiders brought disruption, made good folks uneasy. The fire. Perhaps he hadn't lit the match, but he had made sure no one asked too many questions. His hands were clean only because he had made sure others dirtied theirs first. Then there was the mayor, Mr. Langley. Slick, polished, a man whose handshake could charm even as his eyes betrayed contempt. He spoke of community values in public speeches, cloaking hatred in the language of tradition. To him, the family's suffering was a distraction from his vision of the town as a model of harmony defined by keeping it white. He wasn't cruel in the obvious way. He was cruel in the quiet way, through policy, through neglect, through the subtle power of pretending not to see. The business owners formed another circle of power. The grocer who refused to stock certain goods once the family began shopping regularly. The mechanic who raised his prices whenever the father brought his truck in for repairs. The banker who delayed paperwork for the small loan the father had applied 4 months before. None of them shouted slurs in the street, but all of them played their part in tightening the noose of exclusion. Their cruelty was transactional, disguised as just business. But not all wore masks. There were others, brash men who didn't hide their contempt. Men who sat at the bar and spoke freely about teaching lessons. Boys who spray-painted fences and laughed when windows shattered in the night. They were not clever, not polished, but their hatred burned openly, giving voice to what the leaders in suits only whispered in private. What made it worse, what made it unbearable, was the complicity of everyone else. The neighbors who turned away when the fire rose into the night sky. The pastor who skipped over the tragedy in his Sunday sermon. The schoolteacher who told the children to move on. Each silence was a brick in the wall. Each turned back an endorsement of the cruelty. The protagonist saw them all now for who they were. The sheriff, the mayor, the business owners, the barroom men. They were not separate pieces, but a single machine. A system. Each one justified their actions in different ways. Some believed they were defending their heritage. Some told themselves they were protecting order. Some simply wanted the convenience of not changing. And others, they were driven by nothing but spite. Yet even among them there were cracks. The sheriff's deputy, a young man barely out of his 20s, often lingered too long when he came to check in. His eyes betrayed discomfort, a flicker of guilt when he parroted the sheriff's words. He signed the same reports, enforced the same silence, but something in him wavered. He was proof that not every cog in the machine turned willingly. The mayor, too, bore his own weakness. Behind closed doors, he feared exposure. His polished speeches hid desperation, the fear that his image, carefully constructed, could crumble if the truth ever spilled into the wider world. For all his power, he was a coward, clinging to reputation more than justice. And among the townspeople, there were whispers. A widow who left bread at the family's door late at night, too frightened to be seen helping in daylight. A young teacher who slipped books into the children's hands, whispering encouragement when no one else was listening. They were not strong enough to stand openly, but their quiet gestures revealed a truth. Not everyone agreed, though few dared to resist. The protagonist began to see the full picture. This was not just about the men who might have carried the torches that night. It was about the sheriff who let it happen, the mayor who ignored it, the businessmen who cheered it quietly, the neighbors who chose silence, and the system that protected them all. What haunted him most was the realization that they didn't see themselves as villains. They believed they were justified. They told themselves they were upholding law, order, tradition. They had twisted their cruelty into duty. And in that conviction lay the greatest danger, because men who believe they are right will never see the blood on their hands. Standing at the edge of his ruined home, the protagonist felt the weight of it pressing against him. This was not a single enemy to fight. It was an entire town, an entire structure, fortified by fear and silence. To strike at one would be to stir them all. And yet, he also knew something else. He knew that structures, no matter how solid, carried their own fractures. Cracks in the sheriff's deputy's conscience, cracks in the mayor's fear of exposure, cracks in the quiet kindness of those too timid to stand. Those cracks, he realized, could be widened. The grief in his chest was still raw. The guilt still gnawed at him, but now there was something else simmering beneath the weight of his despair. A grim understanding. His fight would not be against a single man. It would be against the silence. Against the system that had allowed the fire to burn. And as he stared into the faces of the sheriff, the mayor, the businessmen, and the barroom men who laughed too loudly at night, he felt the shift inside himself. He was no longer just a grieving father, no longer just a broken man staring at ashes. He was a man who had seen the true face of his enemy, and that made him dangerous. He was a man who had seen the true face of his enemy, and that made him dangerous. For weeks, grief had chained him, dragging him into nights where sleep was fractured by screams only he could hear. But now something shifted. The grief was still there, coiled around his chest like barbed wire, but beneath it grew a clarity. He could not remain a victim, could not stand silently in a town that had tried to erase him and his family. If the sheriff and mayor and every complicit neighbor believed silence was enough to bury the truth, then he would dig it back up, even if his hands bled from the soil. His first step was simple. Watching, he began to move through the town with a different gaze. Every conversation at the barber shop, every careless joke overheard at the grocery store, every sideways glance from a man who couldn't quite hold his star all became pieces of a puzzle. He walked with the patience of a hunter, listening, memorizing, filing away fragments of truth. But listening wasn't enough. He began to ask questions, carefully, at first. He cornered a boy in the alley behind the market, the same boy he had once seen scrawling slurs across fences. The boy's bravado crumbled under his stare. "I don't know nothin'," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The father pressed harder, his voice low, dangerous. Finally, the boy blurted out a name. One of the men at the bar, one of the ones who laughed too loud when windows broke. It was the first thread. He tugged it, and the weave began to loosen. The protagonist visited the bar himself, slipping in like a shadow. The men at the counter eyed him with contempt, their voices louder now, mocking. He didn't rise to it. Instead, he ordered a drink, sat quietly, and listened. Drunken tongues wagged more freely than sober ones, and before long, he heard it, the careless brag of a man too sure of his safety. "Taught em a lesson," one sneered, his friends chuckling. "Don't think they'll be rebuilding anytime soon." His fists clenched until his nails cut his palm. He wanted to stand, to smash the glass against the man's skull, to scream his daughter's name until the whole place fell silent. But he didn't. Not yet. He swallowed the rage like poison, storing it for later. Vengeance would come, but not in a drunken brawl. It needed to be deliberate, controlled, precise. Still, each step he took pulled him closer to a line he had never thought he'd cross. At night, he began writing names on scraps of paper, hiding them beneath the mattress. The sheriff, the mayor, the grocer, the men at the bar. His list grew with each whisper, each careless laugh overheard in the shadows. It was no longer just about those who set the fire, it was about all who had kept the silence that allowed it. But with each name written, the moral weight pressed harder. Was this justice or revenge? He wrestled with the question daily. His wife saw the change in him, the hardness carving into his features. "This path," she warned, her voice trembling, "it won't bring her back. It won't heal us." He looked at her, the woman who had stood beside him through every trial, and felt the sting of truth in her words. But then he looked at the ashes where his daughter's laughter had once lived, and he knew he could not forgive silence. The conflict tore at him. By day he was father and husband, clinging to what was left of his family. By night, he was something else, someone darker, someone who stalked alleys and listened at doors. He was no longer just a man seeking justice. He was a man preparing for war, and yet, even war required allies. He began quietly seeking those cracks he had noticed before. The deputy, the young man whose conscience betrayed him in fleeting glances. One evening, he caught him outside the station, cornered him in the shadows. At first the deputy stammered denials, insisting he knew nothing. But under the weight of the protagonist's grief-fueled stare, his resistance faltered. "It wasn't just kids," the deputy whispered finally. "They knew what they were doing. And the sheriff told us to leave it alone." It was confirmation of what he already knew. And it gave him something else. Proof that not all were unshakably loyal to the machine. A school teacher, too, offered quiet help. She had seen the bruises on his son, had overheard the cruel whispers from other parents. One evening, she slipped him a folded piece of paper, notes of who had been where the night of the fire. Whispers carried by children to careless homes. It wasn't much, but it was another thread. Piece by piece, he built a map of complicity. It stretched wider than he had ever imagined. The fire had been the work of a few hands, but it had been permitted, shielded, even celebrated by many more. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. People began to notice his presence in places he didn't belong. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. A bottle was thrown at his feet one evening, shattering on the pavement. As a voice sneered from the dark, "Go back where you came from." He didn't flinch. Not anymore, but inside, the battle raged. At night, he sat staring at his list of names, his mind torn between two visions, one where he exposed them, dragged them into the light of truth, and forced justice upon them, and another where he silenced them permanently, one by one with his own hands. Justice or revenge, truth or blood, which path was his? The more he questioned it, the more he realized the line between the two was blurring. Could justice exist in a town where the sheriff erased crimes with a shrug? Could truth matter when silence was stronger than screams? Perhaps revenge was the only justice left, and so, step by step, he embraced the darkness he had once feared. He confronted the grocer, staring him down until the man's smug smile faltered. He stood in front of the mayor at a public meeting, refusing to lower his gaze, his silence heavier than words. He began to haunt the men who had laughed in the bar, appearing in their path, standing too close, letting them see in his eyes what was coming. Each confrontation was a crack in the facade. Each action felt like a trespass into a self he no longer recognized. But with every line he crossed, he grew more certain. He was not powerless anymore. For the first time since the fire, the town began to feel fear. And that fear was only the beginning. For the first time since the fire, the town began to feel fear, but fear is a double-edged weapon. It cut both ways. At first, it was subtle. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Men at the bar stiffened under his gaze, their laughter faltering. The grocer no longer mocked him openly, but his prices doubled overnight. It was as if the entire town had agreed upon a single strategy. Starve him, corner him, remind him that he was alone. Then came the warnings. A letter appeared under his door one morning, no signature. No handwriting he recognized, just 5 words scrawled in black ink. Leave before it's too late. He burned the paper in his palm, but the words lingered. That evening, the sheriff himself came to check in. He leaned against his patrol car, tipping his hat with that same smirk he always wore. "You've been busy," he drawled, asking questions, stirring up trouble. Folks don't take kindly to that. His tone was light, but his eyes were stone. "For your family's sake, maybe it's time to let the past rest." It was not advice. It was a threat, and it worked. It's poison. At home, his wife pleaded with him. "They'll kill us if you don't stop," she whispered, clutching his arm. "Please, we've lost enough." Her voice cracked, her body trembling with fear. For a moment, his resolve wavered. Was he destroying the very thing he was trying to protect? But then he remembered the fire, the laughter in the shadows, the scream that still woke him at night. He could not stop. He would not. The pressure mounted. Allies began to falter. The young deputy who had once whispered truth now avoided him, his eyes darting nervously whenever their paths crossed. When confronted, the boy stammered, I can't help you anymore. They're watching me. If I say another word, I'll lose my badge or worse." Even the teacher who had slipped him names withdrew. One afternoon, she approached him in the schoolyard, her face pale, her voice barely audible. "I have children," she said. "If they know I've spoken to you, they'll punish them too." "I'm sorry." She walked away quickly, her head down, leaving him standing in the dust. Betrayal cut deeper than threats. It wasn't malice, it was fear. The system didn't need to kill his allies. It only needed to frighten them into silence. Soon, even relatives turned against him. A cousin from a nearby county drove out to see him, his voice urgent. "You're fighting a war you can't win," he said. "These people, they'll bury you before they let the truth come out. Take what you have left and leave." His cousin's eyes burned with sincerity, but beneath it was cowardice. It was easier to run than to fight. The protagonist listened, silent, then turned his gaze back toward the ashes of his home. "If I leave," he said quietly, "then she died for nothing." The cousin shook his head, muttered a prayer, and drove away. The town escalated. Strange cars idled outside at night, headlights piercing the windows until dawn. The hammer by his door became an extension of his hand. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps circling the house, whispers in the dark. Once, he found a dead animal nailed to his fence, blood dripping down the wood. It was a message: we know where you sleep. And yet, intimidation only hardened him. Fear had already taken everything he loved. What more could it steal? Then came the legal attack. One morning, a deputy arrived with papers, citations for disturbing the peace, claims that he had threatened townsfolk, accusations of trespassing, lies, every one of them, but lies written on official letterhead carried weight. He was summoned to court, forced to stand before a judge who never met his eyes. The fines were impossible to pay. The charges meant to break him financially. But what struck hardest wasn't the court's corruption, it was the realization that the law itself was just another weapon against him. The same system that had dismissed the fire as accidental now branded him as the problem. Still, he fought back. He walked out of that courthouse with his head high, the papers crumpled in his fist, and swore silently that if the law would not deliver justice, he would carve it out himself. It was during one of his late-night wanderings that he uncovered the depth of the corruption. He followed the sheriff one evening, trailing him from a distance through the back roads that wound out of town. The patrol car stopped at a farmhouse on the outskirts. Lights burned inside. The protagonist crept close enough to hear voices through an open window. "You did good that night," the sheriff's voice drawled. "Scared him off for good, but he's too stubborn to leave." Another voice, one of the barroom men, laughed. "Maybe we should finish the job." The sheriff's reply chilled him. "Not yet. If he steps too far out of line, we'll make sure it looks like his fault. Till then, let him hang himself." The word sliced through him. It was confirmation. The sheriff wasn't just covering up, he was complicit. He had sanctioned it. The law wasn't broken, it was designed to protect the guilty. He stumbled back into the shadows, his chest heaving. The truth burned hotter than the fire ever had. This wasn't about a few hateful men. It was about an entire system built to erase him and his family, brick by brick. The isolation grew unbearable. His wife withdrew, exhausted by the constant threats. His children, once carefree, now huddled close, their eyes wide with fear every time a car slowed outside. Even the widow who had once left bread at the door stopped coming. Too frightened to be associated with him, the town had succeeded in making him a ghost, unsupported, unwanted dot, and yet, in that ghostliness, he found a strange strength. Because ghosts cannot be threatened. Ghosts cannot be silenced. Ghosts move unseen, unhindered by fear of death, because death has already visited them once. He began moving differently, no longer desperate, no longer pleading for justice. He was colder now, more deliberate. He knew who they were. He knew how far the corruption stretched, and he knew no one would help him. That knowledge freed him. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes were darker, sharper, haunted. His face carried lines of exhaustion, but also a grim determination. He was no longer the hopeful father who once dreamed of building a repair shop. That man had died in the fire. What remained was something else, something forged in ash and silence. He was ready to fight alone, but the town was ready to. The system tightened its grip, closing in around him. Each day brought new obstacles, fines, threats, whispers. Each night grew heavier with the knowledge that every move he made was watched. And yet through it all, one truth pulsed in his chest like a second heartbeat. They killed my daughter. They burned my home. And they think they will get away with it. The thought consumed him, fueled him, carried him through the darkness. He had lost everything that mattered, but in losing it, he had gained something the town could never control, resolve. The system had resisted, and in doing so, it had stripped him of allies, of safety, of peace. But it had also stripped him of hesitation. He no longer wrestled with the question of fleeing. There was nowhere left to run. Isolation had not broken him. It had remade him, and now, the town would learn what it meant to fight a man with nothing left to lose. And now, the town would learn what it meant to fight a man with nothing left to lose. The days leading to the confrontation felt unreal, as though the world itself held its breath. The air was heavy, charged, waiting. The protagonist moved like a shadow, watching, waiting, preparing. Each step was deliberate. Each decision weighed with finality. He knew the time had come not for questions, not for searching, but for truth. And truth would demand blood or sacrifice. It began on a Friday night, when the town gathered at the bar and the sheriff's patrol car idled outside, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Inside, the laughter was loud, false, the kind that came from men who believed themselves untouchable. The protagonist stepped into that room, and silence dropped like a blade. Every eye turned. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, hand resting on his holster, a smirk curling his lips. The mayor sat nearby, his polished shoes crossed, drink in hand, eyes narrowing with disdain. Around them, the arsonists, the barroom men who had laughed about teaching lessons, shifted uneasily. They had bragged when they thought he was broken. They did not laugh now. The protagonist stood in the doorway, his presence alone louder than any word. He carried no weapon visible, but his grief, his rage, his resolve were weapons sharper than steel. Slowly, he walked forward, boots heavy against the wood. "You burned my home," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "You killed my child, and you think you'll live your lives like nothing happened." The sheriff's smirk tightened. "Careful," he drawled, rising to his feet. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're nothing but a man screaming into the wind. Then why are you afraid?" The protagonist asked, his eyes locking on his dot. The room tensed. The barroom men shifted, hands twitching, toward bottles, toward fists. The mayor cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This is not the way," he said smoothly. "You're upset, understandably, but violence won't bring your daughter back. Walk away before you do something you can't undo." The words were meant to soothe, but they dripped with cowardice. The protagonist saw it clearly. They wanted him gone not because they cared about peace, but because they feared exposure. He stepped closer, closing the distance to the sheriff. His voice grew sharper, steel against steel. "You stood by while they lit the fire. You told your men to look away. You let her die." The sheriff's face hardened, the mask slipping. "I did what I had to do," he spat. "For this town, people like you don't belong here." The words struck like a blow, but they also solidified everything. This was not misunderstanding, not ignorance. This was hate wrapped in duty, cruelty wrapped in law. The first punch came from one of the arsonists. A bottle swung wide, shattering against the table. The protagonist moved fast, fueled not by strength alone but by grief sharpened into fury. He caught the man's wrist, drove his fist into his face, and the bar erupted into chaos. Chairs overturned, glass shattered, men shouted. The protagonist fought like a man possessed, every strike carrying the weight of his daughter's scream, every blow echoing with loss. He was outnumbered, but grief lent him power, and rage made him relentless. The sheriff lunged, his pistol flashing. A shot rang out, splintering wood, but the protagonist slammed into him, knocking the gun away. They crashed to the floor, rolling, fists colliding with flesh. The mayor shouted for order, his voice drowned in the storm. The barroom men surged, fists and boots striking. Pain tore through the protagonist's ribs, cracked. Blood filled his mouth, but still he rose, still he swung, still he refused to fall. He was not fighting for survival, he was fighting for truth, for memory, for the ghost of a child who deserved justice. And yet, amid the blood and violence, the deeper battle raged inside him. Each strike brought him closer to the line. Was he delivering justice or becoming the same monster who had laughed at flames? His daughter's face flickered in his mind, her laughter, her innocence. Would she want him to kill? Would she want him to descend into the same darkness that took her? The sheriff's voice, guttural, broke through his thoughts. "You'll never win, even if you kill us. The town will bury you. The law will bury you. You're already dead." The words echoed, but they carried no fear now. The protagonist looked down at him, his fist raised, blood dripping from his knuckles. He could end it here. One blow, one act, and the sheriff would pay in blood. Justice, revenge would be his. But another voice whispered inside him, his wife's voice. "This path won't bring her back." The bar was chaos. Men shouted, glass crunched, fists flew. Yet in that moment, time slowed. His breath came ragged, his heart pounded. His fist hovered in the air, suspended between two worlds, one where he gave in to the fire inside him, and one where he rose above, refusing to let them turn him into what they already believed him to be. The choice was his. He lowered his fist. Gasps filled the air. The sheriff sneered, spitting blood, mistaking mercy for weakness. "That's it. That's all you've got," he taunted, but the protagonist's voice cut through the room like thunder. "No, that's not all. I will expose you, every one of you, your words, your deeds, your silence. The world will see what you are." The mayor's polished mask cracked, fear flashing in his eyes. The arsonist shifted uneasily. The sheriff tried to rise, but the protagonist shoved him back down, his eyes blazing. "This isn't about killing you," he said. "Killing you would make me like you, and I refuse. This is about making sure your names are remembered for what you did, not hidden, not erased. For once, the silence will end." He stood, bloodied, battered, but unbroken. The room stared, stunned. The sheriff's pistol lay on the floor, gleaming in the light. He picked it up, held it for a long, heavy moment, then placed it back on the table, a deliberate act of defiance. He would not be their mirror. The consequences were immediate. Men shouted, Threats flew, but beneath the noise was fear, their fear. They had expected him to break, to lash out blindly, to confirm their lies. Instead, he had shown them something far more dangerous. He had shown them restraint. He had shown them that he could rise above their hate while still exposing it as he staggered from the bar into the night. Blood running down his face, he knew the fight was far from over. The system would tighten its grip. They would come for him harder now, through courts, through threats, through violence. But he had made his choice. He would not kill them. He would not let vengeance consume him. He would burn them with truth instead. And as the cool night air filled his lungs, he felt it for the first time since the fire, the faintest flicker of something almost forgotten. Not peace, not forgiveness, but strength. The kind of strength that comes not from destruction, but from refusing to be destroyed. The bar still echoed with chaos behind him, but ahead stretched a path carved in blood, grief, and resolve. Whatever came next would define not just his fate, but the story his daughter's memory deserved, and he was ready. He was ready, but readiness did not mean victory. The barroom confrontation had shaken the town, left cracks in the facade of silence. Yet, in the days that followed, the system closed ranks with a ferocity he had not fully anticipated. The sheriff filed reports branding him a violent agitator. The mayor stood at a podium, condemning disruption and hostility from individuals unwilling to integrate peacefully. Newspapers in nearby counties carried portraying him as unstable, dangerous, a man unraveling. Justice, he learned, was never about truth. It was about who controlled the narrative, and they still controlled it. Still, the bar was no longer buzzing with laughter. Fear rippled through the men who had once boasted of teaching lessons. They spoke in hushed tones now, avoiding his eyes, avoiding even their own reflections. The truth was creeping in, no matter how hard the sheriff tried to bury it. And then came the break. A reporter from the city arrived, drawn by whispers of corruption, by the smoke of a story too large to ignore. She sought him out quietly, late at night, notebook in hand, eyes sharp with both pity and purpose. "I've heard what happened," she said, "but I need more than whispers. I need proof." Proof. That word hung heavy. He had no photographs, no recordings, only scars, ashes, and memories that burned too vividly to be doubted. But he also had names, times, words overheard, a deputy's guilty glance. Piece by piece, he laid it all before her. The reporter listened, scribbling furiously. "If half of this is true," she whispered, "this town won't survive the storm that's coming." For the first time, hope flickered. Perhaps his daughter's death would not vanish into silence. Perhaps the world beyond this town would see. But hope is costly. The retaliation was swift. His house, the borrowed shelter where his wife and children now stayed, was vandalized, walls smeared with threats. A stone shattered the window one night, missing his son's head by inches. His wife wept, begging him to stop. "They'll kill us all," she pleaded. Her voice was raw, her eyes hollow. "Please, let it go." And here lay the cruelest wound. His quest for justice, born from love, was tearing the remnants of his family apart. His wife no longer saw him as protector, but as the flame drawing death closer. His children shrank at every shadow, every knock at the door. He asked himself, in the stillness of night, was I avenging her, destroying the rest of them? The answer never came. The storm broke weeks later, when the reporter's story went public. Pages filled with accounts of a fire called accidental, of threats ignored, of a sheriff's complicity and a mayor's indifference. Names were printed, corruption exposed. The town, once hidden behind silence, was laid bare for the world to see. It should have been a victory, but victory tasted bitter. The sheriff resigned under pressure, though never jailed. The mayor vanished from public view, his career in ruins, but his life untouched. A handful of men faced charges, but lesser ones: arson, vandalism, not murder. The system had given them scapegoats, not justice. And through it all, the protagonist watched from the sidelines, weary and broken. The world now knew, but the price had been unbearable. His wife left, unable to endure the endless fear. She took the children and went to live with her sister in another town. Her final words to him were whispered, not in anger but in sorrow. "You've given everything to the dead, but the living need more." He could not follow her. He could not leave the ashes, so he stayed. Alone, the burned lot remained. Blackened earth and skeletal beams, still jutting skyward like broken ribs. The town avoided it, as though it were cursed, but he returned every day. He knelt in the dirt, sifting through soot that no longer stained his hands, staring at the ground where his daughter's laughter had once lived. People whispered when they saw him. Some called him mad, others called him brave, but none came close. He had become a monument, living but hollow, the embodiment of resilience scarred beyond repair. At night, he walked the streets like a ghost, unafraid of shadows, unafraid of threats. He had already lost what mattered most. Fear could claim nothing more. The reporter returned once, months later, finding him at the ruins. She asked if he felt justice had been done. He looked at her, his eyes empty of illusions. Justice, he said softly. Justice would be hearing her laugh again. She wrote his words in her notebook, tears in her eyes. But he knew they would never capture the truth. Justice was a story for papers. His reality was silence, smoke, and an empty chair at the table. And yet, even in that silence, he endured. He endured because to give up would mean the town had won. He endured because his daughter's memory demanded it. He endured because he had become something larger than himself, a symbol, not of victory, but of survival in a place that had tried to erase him. One evening, as the sun set over the ruins, casting long shadows across the ash, he stood alone, the wind whipping through the broken beams. He closed his eyes and listened. For a moment, in the rustle of the grass, in the whisper of the air, he thought he heard her laughter. It was faint, fleeting, but enough to draw a tear down his scarred face. He opened his eyes, and the world was the same, empty, cruel, unyielding. But he stood taller, shoulders squared against the coming night. The fire had taken his home. The town had taken his peace. Even justice, when it came, was hollow, stripped of satisfaction. But they had not taken him, and in the end, that was the tragedy, and the triumph. He was alive, though living like a shadow. He was resilient, though scarred beyond healing. He was a man alone at the edge of ruins, holding nothing but memory and refusing to let that memory die. The last image was of him standing in the blackened lot, smoke long since gone, yet his presence making it eternal. Not a victor, not a hero, but a survivor, haunted, broken, unyielding. And as the night swallowed him whole, he became what the town could never destroy, a living reminder of their sin, a scar carved into the earth itself.